Uh, Thank you, sir. On behalf of Federation of Telangana Chambers of Commerce and Industry, I extend my warm welcome to all the participants from across the globe today's webinar. As a part of our institution's numerous efforts to acclimatize the trade and industry to these unprecedented times, we are glad to associate with Sinica in organizing this webinar on appointment and qualifications of arbitrator changing scenario. The appointment of an arbitrator is a crucial and mandatory procedural requirement to set the arbitral process into motion. As you are all aware, the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996 was amended by Act 2015 and also by Act 2019 to accelerate India's vision of becoming an arbitration hub. Consequently, the 2015 Amendment and 19 Amendment Act have also significantly changed the procedural law for the appointment of the arbitrator. The arbitrators appointed by judiciary are generally their predecessors, and there is a concern for high fee charged. The arbitrator should be chosen carefully because of his special knowledge of the subject and matter which is in dispute. He must give attention to the facts in dispute placed before him, and his decision should be practical, well-reasoned, and impartial, and in the best interest of the justice, good governance, conscience, and equity. I come from broking fraternity. We have institutional arbitration at National Stock Exchange and Bombay Stock Exchange, which they provide a panel of arbitrators. So each of the disputing party can select from them, sir. I am sure that our today's learned speaker, Sri Murari Raghavan, Senior Advocate, High Court, Madras, will share his wisdom and enlighten the audience. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ashok. Good afternoon to all, and good morning and good evening for few of those in different time zones. On behalf of CNSCA and our event associate, the Federation of Telangana Chambers of Commerce and Industry, I am privileged to welcome all the participants for today's study series. You have been a constant source of support for Sinica to conduct the study series. The legitimacy of an arbitration proceedings hinges largely on the independence and impartiality of the arbitrator so appointed. It was for this reason that the legislature adopted the recommendations made by the Law Commission in its 246th report by amending the Arbitration Act in 2015. Section 12 of the Arbitration Act lays down the grounds on which appointment of an arbitrator can be challenged. Amendment Act of 2015 has also added 5th schedule and 7th schedule to the Arbitration Act. These schedules list out the grounds that give rise to justifiable doubts as to the independence or impartiality of an arbitrator. Further, Amendment Act of 2015 also seeks to ensure the neutrality of the arbitrator being appointed. It provides that a person sought to be appointed as an arbitrator has to disclose in writing about the existence of any relationship or interest which is likely to give rise to justifiable doubts as to his neutrality. The issue of neutrality of arbitrators, particularly when one party is interested in the outcome of the arbitration, has been a cause of much concern in the recent past. This led the Law Commission to observe its 246th report that a sensible statutory scheme cannot permit appointment of an arbitrator by one who himself is a party to the dispute, or two, who is employed by one of the parties to the dispute, thereby being interested in the outcome of the arbitration. The three-judge bench of the Supreme Court in railway electrification has carved out an exception to the principle enunciated in TRF Limited and Perkins Eastman. The court in railway electrification upheld the validity of the arbitration clause where a party having the unilateral power to appoint an arbitrator constituted a panel of arbitrators. The other party has the option to choose an arbitrator from the panel. This, the Supreme Court held, counterbalanced the unilateral power to appoint an arbitrator by one party. The interplay between the provisions of the Arbitration Act, which provides for neutrality of an arbitrator, when juxtaposed to the unilateral power of the central government to appoint an arbitrator under the National Highway Commission Act. The 2019 Act encapsulates various recommendations made by the high-level committee formed under the chairmanship of Justice B.N. Sri Krishna, retired Judge, Supreme Court of India, which submitted its report on 30th July 2017. The committee was constituted by the central government in order to eliminate some challenges with respect to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 2015 and rationalize institutional arbitration vis-a-vis ad hoc arbitration. The 8th schedule has included the Arbitration Act, while the 2019 Amendment Act provided objective clarity by way of standardizing eligibility requirements for the appointment of an individual as an arbitrator. With the 2019 amendment, the legal framework surrounding arbitration in India has witnessed a paradigm shift in recent years. Today's topic to the study series, Appointment and Qualification of Arbitrator, Changing Scenario, thus has a very great significance. We have with us today one of the eminent men of law in Mr. Murari Raghavan, Senior Advocate, High Court of Madras, a person who exhibits innate brilliance and is endowed with very high intellect and legal acumen. He always carried his distinction and his achievement with humility and ease. May I request Saravanan, our chairperson, to introduce the speaker. Saravanan, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramakant, and thank you, Mr. Anand, for your welcome address. Good evening and my warm greetings to one and all. The scenario in the appointment and qualifications of arbitrator is changing, consequent to the amendments made in the Arbitration and Conciliation Act in the years 2015 and 2019. As regards the appointment of arbitrator by one of the parties to the contract, the judgment rendered by the Honorable Supreme Court of India in TRF case and Perkins case are having far-reaching effect. As regards the multiple or repeated appointments of a particular person as arbitrator by one of the parties, the law is settled down by the Honorable Supreme Court of India in HRD Corporation case. The conundrum relating to challenge in the appointment of arbitrator is a common issue throughout the world. In this background, today's topic on the changing scenario in the appointment and qualifications of arbitrator is very much imperative to be discussed. The resource person on today's topic is Mr. Murari Raghavan, Senior Advocate. Mr. Murari needs no introduction in the legal circle, more particularly in the fields of commercial, corporate, and arbitration law. However, the custom warrants to give a brief note about Mr. Murari Raghavan. Mr. Murari Raghavan began his legal career in the year 1976 in the chambers of Mr. T. Raghavan, one among the doyens in the field of corporate litigation. He soon built up a considerable practice in the area of commercial litigation while simultaneously extending his expertise into corporate transactions. In addition to the Madras High Court, he has been appearing before a number of other courts and is known for the expertise he brings to complicated corporate disputes. He has extensively represented clients before the Company Law Board, National Company Law Tribunal, the Debts Recovery Tribunal, and the Debts Recovery Appellate Tribunal. He has appeared in several matters before the Company Law Board and the National Company Law Tribunal on shareholder disputes. With the advent of the IBC, he has represented both creditors as well as corporate debtors before the NCLT. He has also vast experience in the field of commercial arbitration with a considerable expertise in engineering and construction arbitrations, apart from commercial disputes. He advises several corporate houses on commercial matters with the practice areas spanning shareholder and investment disputes, construction and engineering arbitrations, and power sector issues, amongst others. He has appeared in several international arbitrations, with the most recent being a dispute between an Indian company and its overseas joint venture partner in relation to a hydroelectric power plant. After a noteworthy practice in excess of 3 decades, Mr. Murari Raghavan was, in the year 2012, designated as a senior counsel of the Madras High Court. I would like to graciously recollect the fact that Mr. Murari Raghavan had on previous occasion participated in the seminar organized by CNICA and made a wonderful presentation on arbitration. As such, Sinika and Mr. Murari Raghavan have a long-standing relationship. Even for this seminar, in a very short notice, Mr. Murari Raghavan has readily accepted and agreed to make a presentation on today's topic, and I thank him very much for the same. On behalf of CNICA, I once again extend my warm welcome and request Mr. Murari Raghavan, Senior Advocate, to deliver his presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Saravanan. I thank CNICA, Mr. Saravanan, Mr. Anand, and Mr. Ashok for inviting me to share a few thoughts in this webinar session, and also for the very generous words they had to say about me. I'm not commenting right now whether it's true or not, but let's see as we go along. The subject that we propose to discuss today is on the changing scenario with regard to the appointment and qualification of arbitrators. It has been changing, and as we go along, you will see the number of times it's changed. Mr. Anand also placed some material on how it has been changing and the need for such change. But in order to understand the change, one needs to go back right to the very beginning. And here the beginning, as far as I'm concerned, would be the 1940 Act, because that's where it all started. I mean, what happened before that is not really relevant in this scenario. But we go back to the 1940 Act. Ashok, can I request you to kindly put up the slide? You can go to slide number 3, which deals with the...
1 second, sir. Yes,
yeah, sure. It is on the appointment and qualification of arbitrators under the Arbitration Act 1940. I think you need to go right to the top of it. It will be slide number. Okay, while we're waiting for that to happen, let me just briefly recapitulate what was happening under the 1940 Act. Because at that stage, arbitration was still in this nascent stage. It was given a stepmotherly treatment because it was always thought of as a poor relative of courts, as a place where people would go as not as an alternative dispute resolution, but as a completely subservient alternative. And that, if you see the series of judgments that happened under the 1940 Act, you'll also see that the way that arbitrators and parties went about it was a certain stepmotherly treatment. Now, as far as the 1940 Act is concerned, party autonomy was everything. There was hardly any manner in which you could interfere with the appointment of an arbitrator except actual misconduct which is shown during hearing, which again is a very subjective expression. Now, there were, you could appoint, I mean, parties could appoint an arbitrator, it could be 1, it could be 3, or whatever number you chose. It could even be 2, as is, there was no question of odd number, even number in the 1940 Act. You could even have 2 arbitrators. And if they deferred, the whole process would start all over again and go to an umpire, which means you start all over again, except for maybe the recording of evidence, everything would start all over again before an umpire. So it was a tedious process. If 2 arbitrators met, they deferred as they would, because each party would appoint their own arbitrator. And it's very seldom that they would agree 100% in everything. It would go to an umpire and the whole process would start. Now, 2 provisions were relevant in the 1940 Act. One is Section 8 and the other is Section 20. Section 8 dealt with the appointment of an arbitrator. The parties disagree. Sole arbitrator, you disagree. You go to court under Section 8 and get an arbitrator appointed. Or if an arbitrator who's appointed refuses to act or is incapable of acting, then you still go back to court. The second provision was Section 20. We just go down, if you can, please, the next slide. Section 20, where you actually filed an application, you filed the arbitration agreement into court, and you pointed out what the issue was, and the court not only appointed the arbitrator, but actually made a reference to arbitration. So what happened is the court in that stage would make the reference to arbitration, which meant that the reference was confined to what was referred to by court. You go to court, you get an arbitrator appointed, court makes a reference saying disputes A, B, and C will be referred to arbitration, and that's all that would happen. You could not go and enlarge it. You probably had to go back to court and get it enlarged or whatever it is. Now, primarily, there was no qualification or disqualification prescribed under the Act regarding an arbitrator, which had, if you see agreements which were entered into and all of which were upheld, where a party could appoint its own employee as an arbitrator. That arbitrator could have even worked on the very work which is subject matter of the dispute. He could be a subordinate to an engineer who was in charge of the dispute, and he could still be an arbitrator. And ultimately, courts have held there have been very few exceptions where courts have deviated from this process. By and large, the law was, you have agreed for this, you have accepted it, you're bound by it. Now you prove that he is actually biased, that he is actually disqualified, or is misconducting himself, come back to me. Otherwise, merely because of his designation or position or something, we are not willing to interfere. That was a position under the 1940 Act. As you can see, there was a lot of open areas, there was a lot of imperfections, but then that was a law that prevailed as on that day. The scenario in 1940 onwards was different, which is why it became necessary to come to the 1996 Act. And this is the position under the 1996 Act. I'll have to deal in this, when we come to the 1996 Act, we'll first deal with three scenarios. We'll deal with the scenario that prevailed in 1996, A, on the question of appointment of an arbitrator, B, on the challenge to an arbitrator, which is the second stage. So that is scenario number one. Scenario number two is, what were the changes which were brought in by the 2015 amendment to this? And thirdly, what are the changes which are being brought in by the 2019 amendment to even this? Of course, those provisions have not yet been given effect to, they've not been notified in relation to the arbitration council, etc., etc. But it is expected that this may happen at any time soon, and therefore I don't think it is premature to actually discuss those scenarios at this point of time. So we'll discuss it in three separate buckets or scenarios. So if we understand where the law is, which meant that what was 1940 was completely imperfect. 1996 something was brought in. It was practiced for about 10, 15 or 20 years, found to be again imperfect. 2015 it was amended. Even that was found to be imperfect, and 2019 further changes have been brought in. Which means that insofar as appointment of arbitrators are concerned, qualification of arbitrators are concerned, the law is growing. It's actually, even now it's developing, and it's not as if things are firmed up to give a firm shape to any of this. Now, if you look at the section 11 and subsection 1, which is up on the screen, it says a person of any nationality may be an arbitrator unless otherwise agreed by the parties. So this would mean that you could agree that a person of any nationality whatsoever could be an arbitrator. Unless, of course, the agreement excludes that. Now, this becomes important, and I'll be coming back to this when we deal with the 2019 amendment, because this seems to depart from this principle, and whether consciously or otherwise, seems to ignore this and put certain restrictions on who can be an arbitrator. We'll come back to this very presently. Now, there's only one requirement basically to an arbitration, and that is that there shall not be an even number of arbitrators. That whole, if I may call it a mess, of two arbitrators, an umpire, and therefore the arbitration proceedings going on for decades and decades, longer than any civil suit, has been attempted to be done away with by having an odd number of arbitrators. You can have one, or you can have three, you can't have two anymore. And that seems to be the basis on this. Now, as far as the procedure is concerned, at that point of time, party autonomy was kept intact without any. It was open to the parties to agree on the procedure for appointment of arbitrators. There were various scenarios which were also brought in. That is, if there was no such agreement, then what would be the position? That is, if there were three arbitrators, each one will appoint, and the two appointed arbitrators will appoint an umpire. And the second thing is, of course, if it's a sole arbitrator, there must be an agreement between parties. In the absence of an agreement, you had to go to court. Now, at this point of time, you will notice one peculiarity in section 11, which has since been done away with. But as it existed, if you look at all of the sections which deal with going to a court, section 9, for example, or any other provision which deals with going to court, it gives a power to a party to apply to a court for suitable orders. But when it came to a section 11 application, it was a chief justice who was named in the section, and of course any person designated by him. But the word used is request, not an application. So therefore the question is that you made a request to the chief justice or his designate for taking the necessary measure or effecting the appointment. Now, therefore, the issue that arose was, what was the nature of the function which the Chief Justice was exercising in terms of these sections? Was it a judicial function or was it a administrative function? That was one of the primary issues that arose, because the recourse to that and what you could do and how you treat that would depend on what it was, what kind of a power was being exercised. And it was being recognized as a request being made to a Chief Justice, not an application being made to court. But before we actually come to that, I also want to draw your attention to subsection 8, which is put up on the screen, because this was the only constraint in the appointment made by the Chief Justice. He would have to give due consideration to the qualifications required of the arbitrator in the agreement, or 2, other considerations for appointment of an independent and impartial arbitrator. So there were 2 requirements which he would have to consider. One is, look at the arbitration agreement. Are there any qualifications being made on the nature of the appointment of the arbitrator? For example, is he to be an engineer? Is he to be a person not below the rank of a chief engineer, or etc., etc.? He would have to give due consideration to that, because that's what parties have agreed. You can't say, no, I'm not concerned with all of that, I'm going to appoint somebody else. Point number 2 is that person likely to be independent and impartial? That's a very, very subjective exercise being made at a very preliminary stage without any guidelines of what would constitute independence, what would constitute lack of independence or lack of impartiality. There were no real guidelines. You had some judgments to that effect, which only said it's a matter to be decided on a case-to-case basis. You can't put down any straight line on it, but that was the subjectiveness. Now, having seen that, the question that arose in the context of this was whether this function would be an administrative function which was subject to the writ jurisdiction of a court, or would it be a judicial function subject to an appellate jurisdiction of a court or other remedy in terms of law. Now, you have 3 judgments. Please go down to the next slide if you can. There were 3 judgments on this aspect. The first was the 3-judge bench on Konkan Railway, which is one of the leading cases at that point of time, where they held that it was actually administrative in character. Please look at him. In every other provision, you're referring to a court. Here, you're referring to the Chief Justice by his designation, or a further delegate of his, and therefore can only be an administrative function, since what we're making to that person was also a request and not an application for an order. This was also confirmed by a 5-judge bench in the Konkan Railway case, because this came up again. This was referred to a larger bench. The larger bench concurred with the smaller bench. It said it's only a gap-filling one, and therefore he was only acting administratively. And therefore this became necessary to be considered by a 7-judge bench in the SPP versus Patel Engineering case, which has now become a landmark judgment insofar as this is concerned, because they have now turned the entire thing. They said, no, please look at what the function is doing. Please look at what is required to do under Section 11. It can only be a judicial function. It cannot be an administrative function. And having said that, they also laid down 2 or 3 parameters which the Chief Justice was bound to look at before he could actually appoint an arbitrator or act in terms of Section 11. One was, he would have to see the existence and validity of an arbitration agreement. Of course, that is paramount. If you go under Section 11 without even an arbitration agreement, the Chief Justice is not going to blindly appoint an arbitrator and say, you fight with that. You go and slug it out with that arbitrator. He was bound to see the existence and validity of an arbitration agreement. He was bound to see whether the parameters for exercising the jurisdiction or invoking that arbitration clause had also arisen. For example, 2 instances I can give you. One is, did you raise a dispute? Did you ask for a reference to arbitration? Did you ask him to appoint an arbitrator? Did he fail to appoint an arbitrator? Did you actually raise a dispute, want the dispute to be referred to arbitration, call upon the other side to appoint an arbitrator, and did he fail? Which again is but the third thing is a little, because the SVP has also said he will have to look at whether there's a live claim or not. Now, what we understand by a live claim is, a claim which is not barred by limitation. In other words, the Chief Justice was required to even look at whether the claims were time barred or not. Now, there could be two kinds of cases. One is where a claim is ex facie time barred. You can look at it, you find out it's barred hopelessly by limitation. The second one is a case where you would require evidence to show that it was really barred. And there would be a counter argument saying, no, look at this amounts to acknowledgement. This does not amount to acknowledgement. My full and final settlement is really not a full and final settlement. Now, all those issues will again have to be agitated before the Chief Justice. It became this judgment, while attempting to give him judicial powers, cast a huge burden on the Chief Justice to consider even the issue of limitation which had to be raised. Now, what also followed from this judgment is that Section 16, whatever could be raised conceivably in Section 16 in relation to the appointment of an arbitrator, could be raised in Section 11, and if so raised, it was for the Chief Justice to consider those objections, and if he found the objections were without merit, he could then appoint an arbitrator. This again went far, it was far-reaching in that sense, and there was further delay which was caused because all of these issues came up for consideration under Section 11. Now, before going to the amendments in 2015, let's also look at the challenge procedure and the challenge issues which were originally envisaged in the 1996 Act. Now, this was in Section 12. What happened was there was a requirement on arbitrator when approached for his possible appointment to disclose in writing any circumstances likely to give rise to justifiable doubts as to his independence or impartiality. Again, a completely subjective exercise. And while an arbitrator could disclose a certain relationship or a certain sequence, I don't think any arbitrator would actually come forward and say, no, I will not be independent or I will not be impartial, especially when you have not laid down any parameters of what could be construed as a justifiable doubt on the independence or impartiality of an arbitrator. So A is a procedure on disclosure by him. Of course, if certain circumstance arose during arbitral proceedings, even that would have to be disclosed. The third aspect is that an arbitrator could only be challenged if A, there were circumstances that gave rise to such justifiable doubts. Again, a completely subjective exercise. A party would have to say now circumstances exist giving rise to justifiable doubts about your independence and impartiality, or he does not possess the qualification. Now, please see what happens. If you go down to the next slide under Section 13, of course, I referred to B.K. Devan's case on what could be construed, because what happened in that case was after an arbitrator had been appointed, one of the parties, you can stay with that. What happened in B.K. Devan's case is once after the arbitrator was appointed, one of the parties appointed him as a consultant on a stipend. Therefore, a party moved saying, look at this, arbitrator has now been engaged as a consultant by one of the parties. Circumstances exist give rise to justifiable doubts as to his independence and impartiality. The High Court said, merely because he's been engaged as a consultant, this will not automatically subsist, and they rejected the contention of the parties. Of course, the Supreme Court said no, this could give rise to it, and found that he was incapable of being appointed as an arbitrator. But having said that, please see what is envisaged in the challenge process. If you really wanted to challenge an arbitrator, challenge his independence, impartiality, who do you make the challenge to? To the arbitrator himself. Now, at least I understand if there is a tribunal of 3 arbitrators, possibly one the arbitrator concerned could be asked to recuse himself. The other 2 could take a decision, though that's not the ideal situation, and you can't really compel him to recuse himself. He doesn't want to. But let's look at a scenario of a sole arbitrator. Now, you go to a sole arbitrator and say, see, I have justifiable doubts as to your independence and impartiality. can't think of any arbitrator, except of course there are some very conscientious arbitrators. But by and large, if you make an allegation saying you will not be impartial, the immediate reaction of an arbitrator is, what nonsense are you talking? Of course I'm impartial, of course I'm independent. I'm going to decide according to merit, and it would be rejected. Now please see what happens in that scenario. You have to go through the entire arbitral process, and if an award is made against you, you would challenge that award, amongst other things, on the fact that he has not been independent or impartial, or that there were justifiable doubts as to such situations. Now, if at the end of that exercise, and I'm sure that most of you know just how long some arbitrations do go on, though they're not supposed to, they do go on for an incredible length of time. Now, at the end of that exercise, if a court finds that, yes, there are justifiable doubts as to his independence and impartiality, he ought not to have functioned as arbitrator. The entire process is nullified, and you start all over again, which means the entire exercise you've done that far becomes a complete a waste of time, and you go back and you start a fresh arbitration on the same thing before some other arbitrator. That was the position that existed under the 1996 Act, and I'm sure you'll agree that it was not the ideal scenario. There was a need to amend Section 12. There was also a need to amend Section 11, because what was happening is the requirement of the kind of you bestow the Chief Justice with a judicial power, and you require him to go into so many scenarios which make it impossible for him to decide things in any emergent manner, which is how Section 11 could work. And in any event, some of those things cannot be decided by him, because unless you have the entire records of the arbitration before him, and sometimes oral evidence also is laid, you can't decide something like limitation, because that's a mixed question of law and fact. So those amendments became necessary by virtue of the imperfections that existed under the 1996 Act, and therefore the 2015 amendment was brought about. This was based on the 246th report of the Law Commission. Now, and if you look at this, this is what the Law Commission has said. Section 12 requires arbitrators to disclose to parties justifiable doubts, circumstances relating to justifiable doubts on the independence and impartiality. But you don't lay down any questions of what could be this. I mean, what is the guideline you have imposed to say what would amount to crossing the line or not crossing the line? Now, while party autonomy is supposed to be paramount, that parties, that the idea of arbitration is to give effect to party autonomy and to go with parties really want. However, there are certain minimum requirements which parties cannot agree upon. And you can't let them go ahead with this without imposing some kind of safeguards, because what is happening is today arbitration, especially by 2015, even by 1996, but definitely after 2015, is being considered as a very viable alternative dispute resolution process to courts. The idea is to declog the courts and to make people go to arbitration, and to make arbitration quick and inexpensive. Now, whether it is achieved either of these, the jury is still out. I'm sure CNICA has something to say on that, but the idea was to make this a very viable alternate dispute resolution process. And for this, if a matter is getting stuck in Section 11 or in Section 12, where you go all the way to the award and come back, you're actually not achieving this purpose, and therefore the need came to amend this, put minimum requirements in the court, and also decide on day one what would be the circumstances which could give rise to such justifiable doubts. Now, please go to the next slide. Now, this also became necessary by virtue of a series of cases which are brought out here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to deal at length with these cases, except point out that in the cases on the left-hand blurb, there's all cases where government contracts providing for arbitration by a serving employee of the department is held to be valid. If you're an employee, your you could, if parties have agreed that you're a serving employee, you may even be concerned with the work. But so long as that's part of the agreement, it's held to be valid. The only exception was carved out in Indian Oil Corporation, where it is held, and rightly so, that there was the direct supervisor of the person appointed as arbitrator was the officer who was in charge of that particular work. He appoints his own subordinate as an arbitrator, and it is expected that this subordinate would be independent and would decide that his superior's decisions were all wrong if situations so arose. So this is where they said, no, we need an independent arbitrator. This person cannot be totally independent or impartial. And this is why the amendments came about. Please pass on, I think we have dealt with this. Please go ahead to the next slide. The 2015 amendments. Now, in the 2015 amendments, two things happened, and I'll first deal with the amendments which we made to section 11. Now, the only major, in fact, there are two major changes. As you'll see, most of it is what was there earlier, except that in 4A, the appointment is made by the Supreme Court in the case of international commercial arbitration, or the High Court in the case of a domestic arbitration, or they were entitled to designate a person or an institution to make such appointment. The idea is again to declog the section 11 process, send it to an accredited institution, because the high courts have accredited certain institutions. Supreme Court has accredited certain institutions. The power is given them to refer to them. They say, you make the appointment. The other significant change you will get in the next slide. Please go to the next slide. In section 6A, because as I pointed out in SPP, you go into whether the preconditions are satisfied, whether the existence or validity of an arbitration agreement subsists, whether there's a live claim. So they made it very clear. The Supreme Court of the case, maybe the High Court, while considering an application under 456, shall notwithstanding judgment, decree, order of court, confine themselves only to the existence of an arbitration agreement. Now, is that agreement valid? Is it not valid? Is not the function of the court. And you'll find here that the expression Chief Justice has been replaced with the word court. It was Chief Justice of the High Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's been replaced by High Court and Supreme Court, recognizing that they're actually carrying out a judicial function. Now, and they've confined them only to the existence of an arbitration agreement. So all they will see is there an arbitration agreement in existence? If there is, then they will refer the matter to arbitration. All objections regarding jurisdiction, etc., will be taken before the arbitrator. Is the agreement valid? Is there other jurisdiction? For example, a precondition like a dispute resolution which had to be undertaken prior to invocation of the arbitration clause. Has that been done? All of that will be considered by the arbitrator, not by the court. The second amendment is, of course, 6B, which is not major. It only says that delegation is not to be considered as a delegation of judicial power. The judicial power still remains with the High Court or Supreme Court. It doesn't delegate the judicial power. It only gives power to make the appointment. So these are the main amendments which came into section 11. Now let us look at the amendments made to section 12. I would only request the organizers, I keep talking endlessly. Please tell me when I'm running out of time so that I'll bring that to a quick close. Okay.
You can take your time, sir. No issues.
Yeah, no problem. You just tell me if I'm overshooting. I'll sort of.
Fine, sir.
Now, here in section 12 is where the major changes happen in terms of this. We saw the earlier open-ended scenario of what would be a justifiable doubt on independence and impartiality. Now, to some extent, the 2015 amendment has attempted to bridge that gap. But as we will see a little later, that bridging has been taken to another extreme altogether. It's not the ideal scenario as we will see now. But before we do that, we again look at section 12(1) remained as it is, except that what was added was existence of any direct, indirect, past or present relation. No, please stick to section 12. Yeah. Past relationship or interest in relation of whether, and this is what has been added, whether financial, business, professional, or otherwise, which give rise to a justifiable doubt. So it could be any of these scenarios. Clause B was added because what has happened is under the 2015 amendment, section 29A was included, which made it mandatory to complete an arbitration within 12 months of entering upon the reference. A court could, you could extend it for a maximum period of 6 months, but that would be the end of the process. So while an arbitrator was being appointed, there would have to be a declaration from him that he has a time to do it, to finish it within 12 months. Because what we're seeing is, we get independent and impartial arbitrators appointed. But those arbitrators are so busy and so tied up in multiple arbitrations that their ability to spend time and finish it within 12 months is becoming a big question mark. And a little later, we will see why that is, because you will also find that the pool of talented arbitrators is pretty small compared to the number of arbitrations that is happening. So therefore, these are the two additions which were made to section 12, both of which are significant, but is it a complete answer to this? Is something we need to see. Now a new section, new explanation was added, which was the 5th schedule, saying that the grounds which are available in the 5th schedule are a guide to determine whether there are such justifiable doubts or not. So therefore, when an arbitrator was giving a declaration under section 12(1), he would look at the 5th schedule and see whether he falls within any of those slots which are enumerated in the 5th schedule. And if he did fall within the slot, he was bound to disclose that there were justifiable doubts regarding his independence and impartiality. Let me assume that he didn't give that disclosure. You could still challenge his appointment as being a person in relation to whom circumstances exist, giving reasons for such justifiable doubts, and you would again have to fall back on the 5th schedule. Now, there is a second provision which has been added, which is subsection 5, which says that notwithstanding any prior agreement to the contrary, a person's relationship with the subject matter of dispute or with a party falls under any of the categories specified in the 7th schedule, then he is ineligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. So therefore, here they have made two distinctions. One is Schedule 5 that gives rise to a justifiable doubt. Schedule 7, which makes him ineligible to be appointed as arbitrator, though there may be a prior agreement, and this is important. It's a prior agreement which is dealt with in this provision. There's a prior agreement, but the person falls within any of the categories on the 7th schedule, is ineligible to be appointed. He cannot be appointed as an arbitrator. Now, please see where they took the 5th schedule and 7th schedule from. It was from the IBA rules relating to international commercial arbitrations. Okay, we just, you could stay there. The IBA rules specify they have a green list, they have an orange list, and they have a red list. Within the red list, they have a waivable red list and a non-waivable red list, all of which comes within the IBA rules. A green list, of course, it's clear the arbitrator can go. Orange list is equivalent to the 5th schedule. A red list is equivalent to the 7th schedule. Now, the waivable and non-waivable parts have been amalgamated and said that prior agreement has no consequence whatever. If you are following with the 7th schedule, if there's a prior agreement, whatever prior agreement you may have is of no consequence. But they've also said that after disputes have arisen, you may waive the requirements of this subsection. That is, after disputes have arisen, if you find that his, and when you say after disputes have arisen, I'm assuming you mean after disputes have arisen and you come to know that a person is falls within the 7th schedule and is ineligible to be appointed, it's open to you to waive it in writing. I mean, if you choose that you want this person as an arbitrator, notwithstanding any ineligibility on his part, it's open to you to waive the requirement. To that extent, party autonomy is still preserved. So this was brought in by the 2015 amendment. Is it a complete blessing? Is something which I'll have to look at? I would not think so. For this reason, if you go now to the 5th schedule, please go down to the next. Yeah, you can even. I think you can go down a little. You can go down a little, Ashok.
This one, sir?
Yeah. Thank you. Now, there were requirements under this that, of course, in 7th schedule, relationship with parties and council, employee, etc., etc. It's understood that if you're an employee and you have a past or present relationship with one of the parties, obviously there will be some, you're bound to disclose it. It's open to the parties after such disclosures to made to accept it or not to accept it. I mean, that is something that is left to the parties to. But the problem arose, if you go down now to the next slide. If you find that the relationship between the arbitrator and another arbitrator, please look at services of one of the parties. Arbitrators within the past 3 years served as counsel for one of the parties, been consulted, affiliate, etc., within the last 3 years. So therefore, if within 3 years you have acted for one of the parties, you are ineligible to be appointed, or rather there will be circumstances. And 3 years seems to be a sort of a cooling off period. At the end of 3 years, if you have not done anything for a party for about 3 years, it's expected that what you did 3 years back is not of consequence. Is not of consequence, and therefore the difficulty is this, that while deciding on independence and impartiality, there is also a cap on the number of times that a party could have appointed the same arbitrator. And they say more than 3 times if you've appointed him. It gives justifiable doubts because you're going behind the same arbitrator for all your arbitrations. And therefore, it's expected that there could be a justifiable doubt regarding his independence and impartiality. Now, is there, if you see this, you'll find arbitrators in the past 3 years receive more than 3 appointments by the council or the same law firm or by the party itself. So therefore, now here you have, this is where the clincher comes, and this is where there is some difficulty. In an international commercial arbitration, which large stakes for which the IBA rules was being considered perfectly valid. I mean, it's perfectly valid because the number of arbitrations are small, the pool of arbitrators is fairly large, and you will be able to meet all of these requirements. But when you import it and apply it to a domestic arbitration, these are the problems that you have, because in a domestic arbitration, you have sometimes very, very small stakes. I'll just transaction, just as an example. There could be thousands and thousands. Every hire purchase company has something like 1,000, 2,000. I haven't taken statistics, but I would expect not less than 2 to 3. Any major hire purchase company will have not less than 2,000 or 3,000 arbitrations. Now, to find arbitrators whom you cannot appoint more than 3 times within the last 3 years, and to find a pool of arbitrators whom you can appoint, avoiding this is a huge, humongous task. It's something which is going to, it poses any number of challenges, because finding talented arbitrators, and I will say this, people who have experience in arbitration, people who are talented, it could be retired judges, it could be advocates, it could be any other, even an engineer, etc., etc. And I'm giving you an example, a finance person where you're looking at hire purchase transactions. Finding people like that who are familiar with both the nuances of the transaction, and where it's a specialized field, the nuances is a specialized field, as well as knowing the law and arbitration. I think The president spoke a little earlier about the stock exchange arbitration. This again is any number of arbitrations. Now, again, finding people who are familiar with the law as well as the nature of stock market transactions so as to be able to understand what could be the dispute that arises between, say, a purchaser of shares and a share broker, or between two share brokers, or any of those transactions. Finding them is going to be a humongous task. And this is where I think there is a certain amount of difficulty. I agree, it's very laudable. The laudable thing is an arbitrator should not make an award favoring a party only in the hope of his getting the next appointment, because that would defeat the very purpose of an arbitration. But this needs to be balanced against the concept of finding a talented pool of arbitrators for these multiple transactions. So that is insofar as the 5th schedule is concerned. Now please come to the 7th schedule, which is just below that. Next slide, please.
Sir.
Yeah. Now you have these various categories. I'm not going into all of it. To point out that in these cases, notwithstanding a prior agreement, that person is ineligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. And I'll only talk on item number 1. An arbitrator is an employee, consultant, advisor, or has any other past or present business relationship with the party. So if he's an employee, consultant, advisor, he is ineligible to be appointed. The only exception is what Mr. Anand brought out in the his opening remarks, which I will also briefly deal with. Otherwise, if you're an employee, current employee, you are eligible to be appointed. The distinction they're making is when they say he's an employee, they're saying past or present business relationship with the party. So if you are a retired employee, a past employee, that doesn't seem to be barred under this provision. It's only if you've had a past business relationship, which is different from an employment. That, in fact, if you're even a consultant or an advisor, you will not fall within the ambit of a business relationship with the party, is what it looks like. So, but let's focus on employee. So if you're a past employee, a retired employee, certainly you will be eligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. Your only bar is if you've had a past relationship. Now, please go to the next slide. And these are, I'm not going to the categories in the interest of time. This is the red list under the IBA rules, which is coming as, next slide also, which is coming as, so therefore the idea was of introducing this, while real and genuine party autonomy must be respected, there are certain clearly avoidable categories where you can't be compelled to go to arbitration, especially if he's your own employee, since that would actually go against the very concept of an independent inquiry by an alternate dispute resolution process. Of course, waiver is permitted in family arbitrations. For example, in a family arbitration, they're bound to happen between relatives, because most families don't want their internal affairs to come out into the public domain. So they will have their own, one relative of theirs as an arbitrator, and in those cases, it is permitted to be waived. So this is the position insofar as the Law Commission's recommendation. Please come to the next slide. You can pass all this. These are only guidelines on what is conflict of interest. Please go to the next slide. The next 3 slides are only a basic thing of what the red book, what the red list, the green list, and orange list contains IBA rules, and how it has got incorporated into our 5th schedule and 7th schedule. This is a green list which says that you can appoint a person as an arbitrator. Please pass on. You can go ahead to the next one. Now, here I'll only touch upon 2 which actually Mr. Anand touched upon to begin with. These are 2 judgments which went into the question of the appointment of an arbitrator by one person. Now, in the first case, TRF, what really happened is a managing director was named as an arbitrator. And obviously, being an employee, he was ineligible to act. So what he did was he nominated somebody to act as arbitrator. And they said he's not acting as arbitrator, he's only nominated. So therefore the Supreme Court went into this question and said, if even the person is ineligible to be appointed as arbitrator, there's no question of his nominating somebody else to be an arbitrator. The second one, of course, is in Perkins. In Perkins, again, while reiterating the principle that a person who's been disqualified cannot appoint an arbitrator, they went one step further and said that in a case of a sole arbitrator, and this again is significant, in the case of a sole arbitrator, one of the parties cannot appoint his own nominee as an arbitrator. You can't say that I will nominate the sole arbitrator. If it's multiple arbitrators, of course, you appoint your arbitrator, he appoints his, and then they get a third arbitrator. But where it's a sole arbitrator, a party who is interested in the subject matter of the dispute cannot appoint an arbitrator of his choice because it is believed that he will attempt to derive some advantage by appointing that person as an arbitrator. Please go to the next slide. Now, these are all post 2015. I'm going to leave this with this, but the basic principle in all these, the only one which I'll deal with is probably the first one, that it says that officers of the PSU are not themselves ineligible to be appointed as arbitrators. See, merely because you're a serving or retired officer of the government, it doesn't mean that in a dispute between one government entity and another, you are ineligible to be appointed as arbitrator, provided you have no connection, of course, with the dispute. If you're connected with the dispute, you would be. But otherwise, you would not. Bharat Broadband Telecom, again, is a question of whether a person could challenge an arbitrator appointed by himself. And because Section 12(4) also gives that provision, that merely because you appoint an arbitrator, you're not precluded from challenging it. But that challenge, they have said, would be before the arbitrator, not before the court. Central Organization for Railway Electrification is what Mr. Anand referred to. This is a case where a tribunal was, that is, they give a list of 3 arbitrators and ask the contractor to pick one of them. They are not, this has not been found to run foul of the 5th or 7th schedule because A, the appointment is not being made by the railways. They are only giving a list and the contractor selects from that list. Point number 2 is, in this case, when the contractor moved under Section 11 to the court, he himself said, please appoint in terms of that relevant clause. So he asked for an appointment in terms of that clause. Then he could not question it, saying, how can you appoint in terms of that clause? I want a completely independent arbitrator. Okay, we'll now pass on to the next slide. Now, this is one judgment on which was considering the 2015 amendments. This is in HRD Corporation versus Gale, which says that every arbitrator should be impartial, independent at the time of his appointment, and doubts are justifiable only if a third party could reach a conclusion that an arbitrator is likely to be bound by factors other than the merits of the case. And where there's no real, if it is found that an arbitrator would not objectively decide the disputes, then of course it will be terminated. But where there is no such actual and proved situation, his mandate ought not to be terminated. Please go to the next slide. There's also the case of Halliburton, which I'll very briefly read. This is an English judgment which goes into the question of disclosure and what is the effect of disclosing and not disclosing these circumstances. And it made it very clear, and I'll only briefly touch upon this. It says that if you have not disclosed it, then actually you're giving room for a doubt as to your independence and impartiality. Otherwise, why would you not disclose it? But having said that, they've also said that if the omission is accidental rather than deliberate, that by itself would not give rise to justifiable doubts. They're saying that it's fair-minded the arbitrator or the possible appointment of an arbitrator, he must make the disclosure to be totally fair-minded and objective about all of it. And if he doesn't, there's a perceived thing that he has not done it with a view to suppress some material fact. But if it's established that is only by inadvertence rather than by design, such a presumption would not take place. And that's a principle set out in the Halliburton judgment. Please go to the next slide. Now let's go straight away to the 2019 amendments, which were brought in. Now here, what has happened in the 2019 amendment, and in the interest of time, I'll very briefly touch upon it. The main position is that under Section 43, a new Section 43A and a new chapter has been introduced into the Arbitration Act, which envisages the establishment of an arbitration council. Specific functions has been designated to that council. One of the functions being that this council will grade and accredit arbitral institutions. It is those institutions then which will make the appointment under Section 11 and not a court, because if you look at the amendments being made to Section 11, Section 11 talks of the appointment being made by an arbitral institution and not by the court, and therefore court intervention in this regard is completely reduced. So therefore this arbitration council has to be set up, accredit arbitral institutions. These institutions would then make the appointment. So because as you have seen now, the function of a Chief Justice or a court has been substantially reduced. You just look at the existence of an arbitration agreement. Don't look at anything else. Well, you don't need a court to sit on it and spend some time just to see if there's an arbitration agreement in existence, because you are not making any decision on the merits of a matter. So therefore, this can be done by an institution. Look at the agreement, make the appointment, everything else remains for the arbitrator to decide. Now, one other aspect, and this is significant, and I'll probably close with this, is that an 8th schedule has been added as part of the 2019 amendment. Of course, these are the functions of the Arbitration Council. Please go to the next slide. Yeah, this is the 8th schedule. Now, 8th schedule has brought in the qualifications of an arbitrator. So as and when an arbitration council has been set up and an arbitral institution is accredited and makes the appointment, there are certain requirements which the arbitral institution should keep in mind by making such appointment. Now, actually, I'll only deal with two aspects. One is the arbitrator ought to be an advocate within the meaning of Advocates Act, I think at least 10 years practice. The other categories are all spelled out here. The two issues that arise here are, one, if a retired judge was registered as an advocate, but let's assume that he has come up through the ranks and has been a judge throughout. Now, and he doesn't qualify to be an arbitrator on the Advocates Act. I'm sorry, he doesn't qualify to be an advocate on the Advocates Act. Could he still be appointed as an arbitrator under this is a question mark. I would assume that he can, but it's not very clear because it really talks about it talks about him being qualified as a advocate, because it says unless he is an advocate within the meaning of the Advocates Act. That is, at that point of time, you must be an advocate on the Advocates Act. If you are a retired judge who has resumed practice and enrolled as an advocate, perfectly fine. But if you are a retired judge who has not resumed practice and has not resumed the role of an advocate post-retirement, whether you can still qualify under this is a question. The second thing is, if you look at all the categories of appointment, they exclude foreign nationals. They exclude foreign nationals, and you can only make the appointee would have to be an Indian national, which again seems to be a kind of a retrograde step or a regressive step in the matter of appointment, because if you're looking at getting a number of international commercial arbitrations in the country, and the idea is to make India as a hub for international commercial arbitration, which is why the whole process of simplifying has happened. Now, you're still telling a party who may not be from this country that you can't appoint anybody who is not an Indian national as an arbitrator, though your agreement may provide for it. And in fact, Section 11(1) has not been amended and still says a person of any nationality can be appointed. But when you come to Section 8, you say, no, sorry. If the arbitral institution is doing it, which is the only manner in which appointment can be made, you will not get a foreign national. In other words, if you are making an appointment, dehorse all of this. If you're doing it with an agreement of parties, perfectly fine. But if you came through the 11 process and the arbitral institution process, you will not get a foreign seated arbitrator as a person. And this actually is a regressive step that I think they should have another look at Schedule 8 and see how it can be structured to make arbitration more positive in this country. I think that I have used up whatever. Of course, there are issues that are going to come up even in this, which I have spelled out here. These are the issues that could come up insofar as all of this is concerned. And this is something which we'll have to look at as we go along, as when it's notified. If there are amendments, as when it's notified, and I hope there will be, then we will have a relook at it. I thank you all for giving me an opportunity to place my thoughts, and I would also acknowledge and thank my colleagues, Umayya, who prepared this entire presentation for me, and my other colleague, Vaishnavi, who also assisted me in making this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we will just check out if there are any questions and in the chat box. Yeah, there are a few questions.
I hope not very tough questions.
Definitely not tough for you, sir. Okay. Anand has got a question, sir. Our secretary has got a question. The ACI is a government body which shall regulate the institutionalization of arbitration in India and frame the policy for grading of arbitration institution. The fact remains that the court's choice in designating an arbitration institution will be limited by the options presented to it by ACI. Consequently, the choice of a foreign party appearing before the Supreme Court and seeking appointment of an arbitrator will be limited to the institutions which have ACI accreditation and to such arbitrators who may be on the panel of such arbitration institution. The court will be equally handicapped in designating an ungraded institution. Your views on that, sir?
Two things. One is, of course, in order for an institution to be accredited, it has to be graded by the ACI. So that's point number one, because the court doesn't get into the question of grading it. But I'm assuming that a court has a residual power to find that if an institution is not functioning as it should, to advise the ACI to remove it from its grading or to downgrade it or whatever it is. That's one part of it. But primarily the grading will be by ACI and not by the court. Secondly, Anand is absolutely right that when it comes before the court and the appointment is to be made by the institution, then the choice is limited to the number of arbitrators who are in the panel of that institution, because its appointment is going to be made within that panel. Now, is that the best arbitrator for those situations? It is hoped that the ACI, the arbitral institution, would exercise due diligence in making that appointment. And I'm sure when it comes before the court, they will also point out the background of the person appointed, especially if it's an international commercial arbitration with huge stakes. And the court would apply its mind to it. And if it found that, say, the appointment is not satisfactory, it could ask the institution to make another appointment. But beyond that, I don't think any power exists in the court to make an appointment by itself, ignoring the appointment made by the institution.
Yes, sir. Mr. Balaji has got 3 questions, sir, actually. He first thanks you for your detailed explanation, and his queries are, number 1, IBA rules is a guiding factor for international commercial arbitration. My lords, I'm breaking, my lords.
No. I'm just making a note of his queries. That's all. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. IBA rules is a guiding factor for international commercial arbitration, where the stake of claim and the complications will be very high. That be so, making IBA rules applicable to domestic arbitration even for a small claim is affecting very much. Perkins' case is having much impact on stereotype cases, more particularly construction, banking, and finance industries. How should we get away with this situation? Shall I go with the next question also, sir?
I think I'll answer this and then we'll
Yes,
go to the next.
yes.
I agree. As I pointed out, the IB rules were never intended to be applied in this scenario at all. They were intended to be applied to international arbitration. They were not intended to apply to a domestic arbitration. So therefore, while they are good guidelines, it cannot be applied across the board. It is probably also relevant to a major domestic arbitration because it's good. But could it be applied across the board to smaller arbitrations? I have a serious doubt because, like I pointed out, you don't have a pool of arbitrators to pick from, making sure that all of these are done. It's unless this is to some extent watered down in due course to make it inapplicable to, say, arbitrations where the stake is below X rupees. I'm not mentioning what that is. At some point of time, we'll have to say that this would apply where the claims are in excess of so much, and also some standards for it. Because otherwise, making it applied across the board is going to create huge problems. Point number two is, yes, Perkins is there, but please see the principle behind Perkins. A party appoints his own man as an arbitrator and keeps appointing the same person as an arbitrator. Don't you think, I'm not on any specifics, don't you think that there is a likelihood of the person being appointed saying, if I hold in favor of this party, I will get the next appointment. If I don't, I'm going to lose my entire livelihood because I will never get appointed and somebody else who's willing to toe the line is going to be appointed. Don't you think that that should be some kind of a guiding principle? So I don't agree that Perkins is all bad. Yes, it does create some difficulty, but it's trying to address a larger issue on independence and impartiality of arbitrators. In fact, on a personal note, I can tell you that right from even before the 1996 Act came into force, I've been fighting this against certain government departments. Unsuccessfully, I can tell you, because the law was different, though we did manage to get it in one judgment before the Supreme Court, but only because of the peculiar facts of that case. But otherwise, in fact, Indian Oil had a clause which says that it is no disability that the person appointed has been in charge of the work. So you have those kind of cases. In fact, I'm fighting now a case in Delhi High Court against NTPC on that. I don't know how far we'll succeed, but as a professional, I would like a situation where we don't keep appointing your own person as an arbitrator and trying to muddy up the arbitral process. I'm not saying that everybody does it. All I'm saying is there is a possibility of that happening. Yeah, second.
Sir, taking advantage of myself asking you, moderating, I have a small doubt in this. Sir, the appointment of arbitrator was always based on the qualification of the arbitrator. That was all along there, and even today, as you rightly said, an employee cannot be appointed. I cannot have a regular appointment of the same person. It's all fair and good. But here in Perkins, my subject to correction by you, the qualification of the appointing authority was brought in rather than the qualification of the arbitrator, which is not envisaged even under the enactment.
Yeah.
So how do we look at it, sir?
How we look at it is like this. In a larger view, supposing I could not be an arbitrator myself because I am conflicted in some manner. Now I go ahead and appoint somebody of my choice to be my arbitrator, to be the arbitrator. Do you think that the element of complete fairness would come into that? That's all that Perkins is looking at. Because if you look at it, there the chairman and managing director was the arbitrator. He was disqualified by virtue of his post. Now he's going to appoint somebody inferior to him or subordinate to him to be an arbitrator. Now, do you expect, it's a question that we all need to ask ourselves, that such a person is going to defy, let's assume in that case, a decision of a chairman or managing director comes into question. So do you really expect a subordinate to say that my superior's decision is illegal or incorrect or malafide or whatever it is? It is on those lines that we're looking at. I agree that Perkins does go far, but this is the principle on which they've been proceeding. So let's look at it from that principle.
And sorry, sir, again coming back to that. There it was not his subordinate that he was going to appoint. He was going to appoint someone else. And number two is, one more thing that came up is, if that is the situation, then we will only have institutional arbitration. The concept of the parties appointing an arbitrator would completely go, and it will be only the institution's arbitration, isn't it, sir?
Sole arbitrator, yes.
Yes.
If it's a sole arbitrator.
If it's a sole arbitrator. Of course, if it is three, they say there is a balance between that, and so it can be gone through. But it's the sole arbitrator, then it will be only institution arbitration.
It need not be an institutional in that sense. It could be a Section 11. That is, I'm talking about the prior to Section 43A being notified. It could be a appointment by the court of an independent arbitrator.
Yes, yes. We'll go to the second question, sir. His second question is fifth schedule and seventh schedule, serial numbers 1 to 19 in common. If arbitrator fails in any of these circumstances in serial number 1 to 19, which schedule is to be considered, fifth or seventh? I think
for that you need to read all of it. I think that's going to take
no, sir. Sir, it will be like this, sir. Seventh schedule will be the ineligibility because 12.5 will come into picture. The rest will be only a guidelines that was only dealt with in HRD constructions.
Correct.
Maybe subject to your.
Correct. No, if you're falling within any of the categories in the seventh schedule, you're straightaway ineligible to be appointed as arbitrator. Now, if you fell within the fifth schedule, that gives rise to justifiable doubts as to your. You see, the point is this: the fifth schedule deals with a disclosure being made by an arbitrator. Now, the disclosure being made by the arbitrator is on all of the matters contained in the schedule. Now, if that same entry falls within the seventh schedule, then obviously the arbitrator will be ineligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. So that is, it's not going by the fifth or by the seventh. Disclosures made under the fifth. If you fall under the seventh, he is ineligible unless you waive that requirement.
Exactly.
If he does not fall within the common entries in the seventh schedule, then you can still agree there could be justifiable doubts. He is not ineligible. It's open to him being appointed as arbitrator. You would actually have to establish that there do exist circumstances giving justifiable doubts. That will be probably the difference between them.
Yes. So the third question, and that is explanation 3 to fifth and seventh schedule uses the word certain specific kinds of arbitration, whether the banks and financial institutions can be categorized in this category.
It of course refers only to two: maritime and commodities arbitration. So,
and it also uses that word, sir.
Such as, I agree, such as, if in such fields, it is a custom and practice. Please read the next sentence. If in such fields, it is a custom and practice for parties frequently to appoint the same arbitrator in different cases, there's a relevant fact to be taken into account by applying. So therefore, you will have to establish that in banking, it is the custom and practice to appoint the same set of arbitrators, which I'm sure will not be there. You see, they're talking about things like the stock exchange or the commodities trade, for example, the Cotton Trade Association, or maritime, because maritime you need expertise not only on arbitration, you need it on maritime arbitration and maritime and admiralty practice. You don't get a whole lot of arbitrators doing that. So therefore, what happens there are certain specific arbitrators. There are some very senior people even in Chennai who are knowledgeable on these aspects. They are both good arbitrators and good maritime specialists. They keep getting appointed. So this is intended to carve an exception to that. So you will have to establish that there exists such a practice. While the examples given are only illustrative and not exhaustive, you would still have to establish that there is a practice to appoint these people repeatedly, which I don't think will exist in a banking or a hire purchase transaction.
Okay. Sir, Mr. Nanda Kumar has got a question. His query is whether disability number 29 is applicable to arbitration institutions like Seneca. That is, 29 deals with the relationship with the law firm appointments. Sir.
Yeah, you're talking about the 5th schedule?
Yes, sir. 5th schedule 29, sir.
Has arbitrators in the past 3 years received more than 3 appointments with the same counsel of the same law firm?
Yeah.
It's very clear. It doesn't apply to an institution. It applies to the same counsel of the same law firm.
Yes, sir. Mr. R.N. Nandekar has sent a query, sir. His first query is, in view of the recent judgment of the Supreme Court, whether provisions in the agreement regarding appointment of arbitrator by administrative department has become void, null, and obsolete.
It again depends on yes and no, because if it's appointment of multiple arbitrators, 3 arbitrators, the administrative department can appoint 1 arbitrator. But if you are a party to a dispute and talks of a sole arbitrator, then whether you can appoint the sole arbitrator is now subject to Perkins judgment. You can't.
Yes.
But I'm not saying it's null and void, because in the case of 3 arbitrators, you can still make that appointment.
Yes. His next question is, which prevails, the provision of the agreement or the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in the matter of appointment of arbitrators? Naturally, the judgment.
There are exceptions for party autonomy. If you look at the amendments, they've carved out exceptions for party autonomy, but this is not one of them. They're saying we want a larger view on how an arbitration should run, because they've obviously perceived difficulties in the way it's run so far because of the various problems that people have faced. Of course, there's still a lot to be done. I mean, I'm sure that CNICA will be aware of various problems on a practical perspective which happens in the matter of running of an arbitration, appointment of arbitrators, which are not covered by 2015 or 2019. I mean, all of us are aware of it. But this needs to be addressed on a case-to-case basis. I think.
Yes, Mr. Sunil Vasudevan has got a question, sir. His question is it okay if the employee of a party is suggested as a sole arbitrator and the other party readily agrees?
I suppose it's okay, because you can always waive a requirement of even the 7th schedule.
Yes, sir.
You know, but it should be disclosed that this person is an employee.
Yes,
you can't hold back that information. And if the person actually been involved in this case, you must disclose it to the other party. Being fully aware of all the circumstances, if the party waives that requirement, then it's open to you, because they still say you're being fully aware of it, you waived it, and you waived it in writing. That's why they're making a distinction between a waiver in Section 12 and a waiver in Section 4. Section 4 can even be by conduct. You can participate in the arbitration. But Section 12(5), if you want to waive, it has to be in writing. Specifically.
Yes, specific. Sir, Mr. Hariharan has posted a question. His question is, I'll read it as it is, sir. How is post-appointment justifiable doubts like subsequent appointment as consultant in VR Dhawan case handled?
Yeah, they have found that if a subsequent action, for example, I'm not an employee on the day I'm appointed, but next day he makes me an employee. In fact, I was doing a case where a person was appointed a director on the company after being appointed as an arbitrator. So these are cases where, which is why if you look at Section 12, it deals with 2 scenarios. One is 15 days of his appointment, or 15 days of coming to know of the circumstances which give rise to his doubt. So if therefore on day 1 there is no justifiable doubt, but the justifiable doubt happens by virtue of a subsequent action, or you come to know of that only much later, you can still challenge the appointment. Because at that point of time, his independence and impartiality has ceased, or is presumed to have ceased.
Sir, Mr. Vijay Kumar has got a question. In case of a company, corporate debtor, under the CIRP process, arbitration is under moratorium against the CD. Can a resolution professional invoke arbitration against a debtor for the determination of disputes due from the debtor to the CD?
Yes.
Yes.
For the simple reason that there are two requirements. One is under section 14 and the second one is under 37 or 38. I forget what the sections. If you're in the CIRP process, the moratorium extends only to proceedings against the corporate debtor, not by the corporate debtor. Once in the event of CIRP process failing and the corporate debtor going to liquidation, then at that stage, all proceedings, by or against, that's a difference in the language you'll get in the two sections. Because then at that stage, all proceedings would come to an end. They subject to the moratorium. So there are two different kinds of moratorium under the IBC. And in CIRP process, yes, the RP can commence arbitration proceedings for recovery of monies to the company.
Lata Kumari has got a question. Her question is point number 1 of 7th schedule. Is there any time limit? Point number 1 relates to the arbitrator being a former employee of the claimant or the person appointed.
Former employee. So the clause 1 talks of is an employee, consultant, or advisor. So
yes,
he has to be an employee.
The
other one is past or present business relationship. There's no time limit.
yes.
But possibly if you're looking at the structure of the entire act, it talks of 3 years. 3 years seems to be a cooling off period. So possibly the 3 years can be applied to this business relationship, though it's not specifically spelled out. But otherwise, if you're an employee, it's only being an employee, a retired employee, there is no constraint against it being appointed as an arbitrator. It's not the ideal situation, I know, because a retired employee is not going to cease to have loyalty to the institution merely because he retired. And please understand, I'm not making any specific, I'm talking in a very, very generic term.
Yes,
I know that I've come across not only past employees, I've come across even serving employees who are very objective and who have considered matters on merit. So I have there are no allegations against anyone, but this is only a perception.
Mr. Ganga Prasad, his query is equivalent to that of Mr. Nandakumar who had already asked. His question is whether institution can appoint the same person more than 3 times.
It doesn't look like
There's any
so far there is nothing in the 8th schedule, because the 8th schedule is by the institution, not the 7th schedule. So 8th schedule doesn't seem to have that bar. And it only talks of, because the 3 times bar does not seem to apply to the
institutions.
Yeah, it doesn't apply to the institution. It's in fact, if you look at 3 years in the, no, I don't think it won't apply to an institution.
Yes, sir. Sir, Lata Kumari has got another question. Sole arbitrator cannot be appointed by the party himself. Is the party allowed to put a panel of arbitrators before the elects for him?
Yes, if you follow the railways judgment, yes, he can put up a panel. But the point is, if the other party doesn't agree in that panel, about that panel, you still go to court and the court could appoint anybody. It's not bound to choose somebody only from that panel.
Yes. Mr. Suresh Srinivasan has posted a question. If the institution alone can appoint an arbitrator, then by my knowledge, there is no institution is now recognized by the High Court Madras in our state. Then how a party can be able to appoint an arbitrator to resolve the disputes? Kindly explain, sir.
First is, I don't agree that no institution has been recognized by the High Court. There is an arbitral institution which has been recognized by the High Court. Be that as it may, as of now, what is happening is the High Court is making appointment. It is not yet delegated to an institution, though I can point out to you that there is an institution recognized by that in Madras at least.
Yes, sir. Manoj Kumar Mishra has got a question. While the law on unilateral appointment of sole arbitrator appears to be settled, gray areas remain on the appointment, whether a sole arbitrator or 3 arbitrators, where the party is only allowed to choose an arbitrator from the panel unilaterally prepared by the opposite party. I think you have already answered this, sir.
And that thing is only on a sole arbitrator. It doesn't apply to a 3-member tribunal at all.
Yes, yes. So we have Lata Kumari also raised her hand. I will lower her hand if she can. Sorry, I'll unmute her. She can ask her question if it is. Madam, you are unmuted. You can raise your question now.
Sir, I already got the answer, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Just like there is a
Sir, not able to get the answer, so I raised my hand. I got the answer. Thank you so very much, sir.
No, just like there's a 3-person appointment for a restriction on arbitrator, there's also a 3-question restriction on each of you.
We have pretty much come to the end of
I have a question, sir. Ashok, I have a question.
Yes, yes.
So it's a very short question, sir. A foreign party often prefers to stay away from an arbitration regime with significant degree of court or governmental interference. The 2019 amendment, though aimed at institutionalizing the arbitration scene in India, leaves the discretion in the hands of courts and executive to decide who gets to be a part of this reform. Is this going to encourage international arbitration?
It's not. For 2 reasons. One is court interference. There's been a lot of back and forth. As you will see in court interference, there's been a lot of back and forth. The idea was to tighten it. SAW pipes opened it up. Your Western Gecko opened it up further. And it could be just anything. Question of reasonableness is a very, very subjective thing. Luckily, now it's got tightened with the 2015 amendment. But still, what is an issue which will fall within the limited parameters of that is still, of course, a matter to be debated. What is a patent illegality? What is a violation of fundamental policy of Indian law? And I don't think a court is going to reject a challenge merely because by deciding on day one fundamental policy, it's going to get entertained. The question, of course, is whether you get a stay or you get a conditional stay and all of that. Now, that's point number one. There's still going to be a court challenge that's not been taken away. It's been reduced. As Justice Sundar is very fond of saying, there were pigeonholes, they've been confined to pinholes now. I'll only borrow this expression because I think it's very appropriate. There are pinholes, but those pinholes exist. Secondly, you are now though Section 11 says any nationality, the minute an institution is involved, it can't be anybody other than an Indian. So you're not really promoting international commercial arbitration by having this restriction. Unless you're willing to open that up and agree that a person can appoint arbitrators of their choice. Whatever, we have excellent arbitrators in India, there's no doubt. But when a person comes from abroad, he prefers to have a person of his own nationality. And please see this in an arbitration agreement, it will generally be held that a third arbitrator would be a person of a nationality other than both these nationalities. So if you have having a person from England and a person from India as disputants, and you have an Indian arbitrator and a second arbitrator who could be from any other nationality. Now the third arbitrator should be of a nationality other than either of these two nationalities, but by virtue of the 8th schedule, that's not going to happen. So really it's not going to, unless there's some reform and these are rescheduled, it's not going to promote it in a way.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, there are 2 more questions. Shall I go with that, sir?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. One is by Mr. Arun Muthuswamy. Can foreign arbitrators be appointed for a matter arising out of an international maritime law?
I suppose you can. There's no restriction. It again is a matter of your agreement. If your agreement doesn't prohibit it, you can always go.
And the last question is from Mr. Patra. He wants to know how to become an arbitrator.
I think you will
be appointed as an arbitrator.
Institution.
Yes.
You need to actually register yourself with one of the empanel yourself with one of the institutions like CNICA or any of the other institutions, and then that's how you get it.
Thank you, sir. For a formal vote of thanks, I now call upon Priyadarshini to render the vote of thanks.
So that was an interesting, informative and thought-provoking presentation on the topic appointment and qualification of arbitrator, changing scenario. The presentation was terse and dignified and was marked with sagacity, insight, acuteness and clarity. On behalf of CNICA and the Federation of Telangana Chambers of Commerce and Industry, I express my deep gratitude to Mr. Murari Raghavan, Senior Advocate, for accepting our invitation and sharing your time and wisdom amidst his busy schedule. Our heartfelt thanks to the wonderful participants who are instrumental in conducting this study series. We are grateful and thankful to our event associate, the Federation of Telangana Chambers of Commerce and Industry, for their graceful support and presence and making this event successful. My thanks to CNICA for giving me this opportunity to present the oath of thanks. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, sir. The next program, we will keep you intimated about the same. And for now, we will close this meeting. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.